You know that haunting melody, don't you? Those crystalline notes that dance through the air like frozen whispers. The Sugar Plum Fairy's theme that signals Christmas magic is coming. Right now, somewhere in the world, a child is watching dancers in pink tutus spinning across a stage. Parents are settling into theatre seats with programmes clutched in their hands. Families are experiencing what they believe is pure holiday enchantment. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about the Nutcracker is a lie? The story playing out on stages across the globe every December isn't the real story. It's been sanitised, scrubbed clean and wrapped in pretty ribbons to hide something much darker underneath. The original tale wasn't written for children at all. It was penned by a man who specialised in psychological horror, supernatural dread, and the thin line between sanity and madness. So before you settle in tonight, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to uncover the twisted origins behind our most beloved traditions. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever felt that something was missing from the ballet version. Because trust me, after tonight, you'll never hear that familiar music the same way again. Now turn down the lights, maybe grab something warm to drink and prepare yourself for a journey into the real Nutcracker. The one they don't want you to know about. Welcome to the story they tried to bury. The year was 1816, and in the German city of Königsberg, a man sat hunched over his writing desk in the flickering candlelight. His name was Ernst Theodor Amadeus Hoffmann, though history would remember him simply as E.T.A. Hoffmann. By day, he served as a respectable judge in the Prussian court system, weighing evidence and delivering verdicts with stern judicial authority. But when darkness fell and the city grew quiet, Hoffmann transformed into something else entirely. He was a composer who understood the mathematics of music, a painter who captured shadows most artists couldn't see, and most importantly, he was a writer who explored the darkest corners of the human psyche with a precision that made his readers question their own sanity. Hoffmann wasn't interested in fairy tales or children's stories. He crafted tales of horror that would make Edgar Allan Poe himself take notice. His stories explored madness, obsession, the supernatural, and that terrifying moment when reality becomes indistinguishable from nightmare. He wrote about automata that seemed human, humans who seemed mechanical, and the devastating cost of genius in a world that feared what it couldn't understand. This was the man who created the original Nutcracker story. Not some gentle storyteller weaving bedtime tales, but a master of psychological terror who understood that the most frightening monsters are often the ones that live inside our own minds. When Hoffmann titled his story The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, he wasn't planning to create a holiday classic. He was crafting a dark examination of childhood imagination, adult cruelty, and the dangerous price of believing in things others can't see. His story would feature blood, genuine blood drawn by broken glass. It would include a mouse king with not one head but 7, each wearing a tiny golden crown and speaking in unison like some hellish chorus. Most disturbingly, it would tell the tale of a 7-year-old girl who becomes so obsessed with a wooden toy that she's willing to sacrifice everything, including her grip on reality, to protect it. The adults around her, rather than trying to understand her experience, would threaten her with institutionalization unless she denied what she knew to be true. This wasn't a story about Christmas magic. It was a story about what happens when the adult world crushes childhood wonder beneath the weight of conformity and fear. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how dark this tale truly becomes, we need to meet the Stahlbaum family and witness their perfectly respectable Christmas Eve celebration. Because every nightmare begins with something ordinary, something safe, something that seems like it couldn't possibly go wrong. In the elegant parlour of a well-appointed German house, the Stahlbaum family prepared for their annual Christmas Eve celebration. Medical counsellor Stahlbaum was exactly the sort of man you'd expect to find in such a position. Proper, methodical, concerned with appearances and social standing. His wife embodied everything a respectable woman should be in early 19th century German society. She managed the household with efficiency, ensured everything ran according to plan, and maintained the kind of orderly domestic life that impressed the neighbours. Their son Fritz was a typical boy of 9 or 10, sturdy and aggressive, fascinated by military things and toy soldiers. He organised elaborate battles in the nursery, staged mock wars with his collection of tin figures, and spoke confidently about becoming a soldier himself when he grew older. Everyone agreed he had the right temperament for it, the hardness, the practical mind, the ability to see things as they truly were without getting lost in fanciful notions. And then there was Marie. Marie was 7 years old, and from the very beginning, she was different. Where Fritz was loud, she was quiet. Where he was practical, she was dreamy. Where he saw toys as objects to be arranged and commanded, she saw personalities waiting to be discovered. She had conversations with her dolls, named every plaything in the nursery, and created elaborate stories about the tiny people who surely lived in the cracks of the wallpaper. Her parents found her imagination charming, but worrying. Children were supposed to be imaginative, of course, but Marie took it too far. She was too sensitive, too inclined to believe in things that weren't real, too ready to invest emotional energy in fantasies that would only disappoint her. They told themselves she'd grow out of it. All children did eventually. The real world had a way of teaching them what was possible and what wasn't. On this particular Christmas Eve, the children waited in agony outside the locked parlour doors. Behind those barriers, their parents arranged the traditional celebration: the tree, the presents, the candles, the careful orchestration of wonder that marked the holiday. Fritz paced impatiently, already knowing what he wanted and expecting to receive it. His father had promised him a cavalry regiment, complete with horses and cannons, and Fritz had been planning military campaigns for weeks. Marie pressed herself against the door, listening to every whisper and rustle from beyond. She didn't know what to expect because she never asked for specific things. She preferred surprises, preferred to be amazed by possibilities she hadn't imagined. This difference in approach would prove more significant than anyone could have predicted. When the parlour doors finally swung open, the sight that greeted them was breathtaking in its careful splendour. The Christmas tree rose nearly to the ceiling, covered in real candles whose flames danced and flickered, making the entire room seem alive with golden light. Ribbons and paper flowers decorated the branches alongside golden apples and silver nuts that caught the candlelight and threw it back in sparkling reflections. Fritz immediately charged toward his presents, tearing through packages with the enthusiasm of a small hurricane. The promised cavalry regiment was there, just as he'd hoped, and he began arranging the tiny soldiers on the floor before he'd even finished unwrapping everything else. Marie moved more slowly, treating each package like a precious mystery. She unwrapped a new dress, a picture book, coloured pencils, a porcelain doll with painted features. Each gift delighted her, but she found her attention drawn to a smaller table in the corner where different presents waited. These were the gifts from Godfather Drosselmeyer, and everyone in the family knew that Drosselmeyer's presents were never quite like anyone else's. Every family has that one relative who doesn't quite fit the expected mould. The one who makes other adults shift uncomfortably in their chairs, who asks questions that nobody wants to answer, who seems to operate according to rules that nobody else understands. For the Stahlbaum family, that relative was Godfather Drosselmeyer. He was the children's godfather, had stood at both their christenings and promised before God to watch over their spiritual welfare. But there was nothing conventionally spiritual about the man himself. He was a clockmaker by profession, a creator of mechanical wonders who understood gears and springs and the precise mathematics of moving parts better than he understood human emotions or social expectations. Everything about Drosselmeyer was slightly off-putting. He wore a wig made not of hair, styled to look like glass, but of actual glass, moulded and shaped into curls that tinkled softly when he moved his head. A black patch covered his left eye, though he never explained the injury or illness that had necessitated it. His face was a landscape of wrinkles, each one seemingly carved by some specific disappointment or strange joy that ordinary people couldn't fathom. Fritz was afraid of him, though he'd never admit it. Boys of his age weren't supposed to fear elderly relatives, especially not ones who brought presents. But something about Drosselmeyer's penetrating gaze and mysterious smile made Fritz find excuses to stay on the other side of the room during visits. Marie felt no such fear. She couldn't explain why, but she sensed that Drosselmeyer understood something about her that nobody else did. He saw the world the way she did, noticed things that other adults dismissed, believed in possibilities that respectable people preferred to ignore. On this Christmas Eve, Drosselmeyer's gift sat waiting on the corner table. It was a mechanical castle, but not the simple toy castle one might expect. This was an elaborate creation with towers and turrets, working drawbridge, and a courtyard populated by dozens of tiny figures dressed in silk and velvet. When Drosselmeyer wound the key in the base, the figures came to life in a carefully choreographed dance. They walked through the courtyard, entered and exited the castle doors, bowed to each other with perfect mechanical precision. A miniature king sat on his throne while courtiers paid their respects in an endless, flawless loop. The children watched, initially enchanted by the spectacle, but Fritz quickly grew bored with the predictable repetition. The figures followed the same path every time, made identical gestures, performed the same dance without variation or surprise. Marie stared at the tiny figures trapped in their eternal routine and felt something like sadness wash over her. They were beautiful, perfectly crafted, but they could only do what they were made to do. There was no room for improvisation, no possibility of change, no hope of escape from their predetermined roles. But Drosselmeyer wasn't finished. He reached into the deep pocket of his coat and withdrew one more gift, something special that he presented directly to Marie with a knowing smile that seemed to hold secrets within secrets. It was a nutcracker. Not the elegant, refined sort that might grace a wealthy merchant's table, but something altogether stranger. About a foot tall, carved to resemble a soldier or perhaps a nobleman, though its proportions were deliberately wrong in ways that made you look twice. The head was too large for the body, the mouth too wide, stretched into an enormous grin that revealed rows of flat, white wooden teeth. The uniform was painted in bright colours, red coat, blue trousers, black boots that gleamed with fresh lacquer. But it was the face that captured attention and held it. The eyes were too big, painted blue with meticulous detail around the pupils. The chin jutted forward prominently. By any conventional standard, the thing was grotesque, almost unsettling in its exaggerated features. Fritz took one look and burst into laughter. Beautiful! That thing looks like a diseased toad wearing a soldier's costume. What's it even supposed to do besides scare small children? But Marie saw something different entirely. When she looked at those painted eyes, she didn't see ugliness or deformity. She saw something that made her heart ache with recognition. Sadness, perhaps. Loneliness. A kind of patient suffering that had been there so long it had become part of the wood itself, carved into every line and angle of the face. "He's beautiful," she whispered, cradling the nutcracker carefully in her small hands. Fritz scoffed and reached for the figure before Marie could react. "Beautiful? Let me see if this ugly thing even works properly. What good is a nutcracker that can't crack nuts?" "Fritz, be gentle!" Marie pleaded, but her brother was already testing the mechanism. He started with small nuts from the Christmas bowl, and those cracked easily enough. Emboldened by success, he moved to larger ones, then the biggest, hardest nuts he could find. The nutcracker's jaws strained against the massive shell Fritz had forced into its mouth. Marie watched in growing horror as her brother pulled the lever with increasing force, determined to prove the toy's worth through brute demonstration. "Fritz, stop! You'll break him!" "Stop!" The sound came sharp and final. Crack. Not the nut, but the nutcracker itself. 3 white wooden teeth broke off and scattered across the floor. The jaw hung loose, cracked along one side, the delicate mechanism ruined beyond repair. Fritz tossed the broken figure aside with casual indifference. "See? Worthless. Can't even handle a decent nut. What kind of nutcracker breaks on the first real test?" Marie burst into tears, scrambling to gather the broken pieces and cradling the damaged nutcracker against her chest. The painted face still wore its wide grin, but now it seemed different somehow. Not grotesque anymore, but brave. Still patient despite the violence done to it. Still kind despite the cruel treatment. "You hurt him," Marie sobbed, collecting the fallen teeth from the carpet. "Marie, it's just a toy," her mother said, with the weary patience adults reserve for children's dramatic moments. "Toys don't feel pain. They're not alive. But Marie wasn't listening to logical explanations. She was looking at the Nutcracker's face, at those painted eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding no wooden figure should possess. She found a ribbon from one of her other presents and carefully wrapped it around the broken jaw, creating a makeshift bandage that covered the worst of the damage. "I'll take care of you," she whispered to the silent figure. "I promise I'll protect you from now on." The Nutcracker said nothing, of course. Its painted eyes stared at nothing in particular. But Marie could have sworn that something in those blue depths shifted slightly. Something that might have been gratitude or hope, or simply recognition that, finally, someone understood. That evening, after the celebration wound down and the family prepared for bed, all the toys were carefully arranged in the large glass-fronted cabinet that dominated one corner of the parlour. Fritz's cavalry regiment occupied the upper shelves in precise military formation, every soldier positioned exactly as regulations demanded. Marie's dolls and the mechanical castle were placed on the middle shelves, arranged with the kind of careful attention that expensive gifts deserved. But at the very bottom, on the shelf reserved for broken or less favoured toys, sat the Nutcracker with his ribbon bandage and cracked smile. Marie knelt before the cabinet, adjusting his position so he wouldn't topple over, smoothing the makeshift bandage with gentle fingers. "You shouldn't be down here," she whispered to the glass. "You should be on the highest shelf of all. But don't worry, I know you're special, even if nobody else does." "Marie!" her mother's voice carried from the hallway. "Come to bed this instant. It's far too late for a young girl to be wandering about." "Coming, Mother." But Marie lingered for one more moment, pressing her palm against the glass that separated her from the Nutcracker. "I'll come back tomorrow," she promised. "I'll come back and check on you." She ran upstairs to her bedroom, but sleep wouldn't come. Something felt wrong with the house tonight, different in ways she couldn't name. The shadows seemed thicker than usual, the silence deeper and more expectant. 3 times she got out of bed and crept to her window, looking down at the parlour windows that glowed faintly with residual candlelight from the Christmas tree. Finally, unable to bear the strange restlessness any longer, Marie slipped from her bed and tiptoed down the stairs. She had to check on her Nutcracker, had to make sure he was safe and undisturbed in his place of honour at the bottom of the toy cabinet. The parlour felt enormous in the darkness, the familiar furniture transformed into looming shapes that seemed to watch her progress across the room. The Christmas tree rose like a dark mountain against the far wall, its candles long since extinguished, but somehow still radiating a sense of barely contained energy. Marie knelt before the toy cabinet and peered through the glass at her Nutcracker. He sat exactly where she'd left him, ribbon bandage still in place, painted eyes still patient and kind. But something about the scene felt different, charged with possibility she couldn't quite identify. The grandfather clock in the corner began its midnight ritual, deep bronze notes rolling through the silent house like distant thunder. Marie counted each strike, her heart beating faster with every resonant tone. 1, 2, 3... The shadows seemed to shift slightly with each chime. 4, 5, 6. The floor beneath her knees began to vibrate almost imperceptibly. 7, 8, 9. Something was building, gathering force like a storm on the horizon. 10, 11. The very air seemed to thicken around her. 12. And in that final, echoing moment, everything changed forever. The world lurched sideways, or perhaps Marie lurched sideways through the world. The familiar parlour began to expand around her, walls stretching away in all directions, furniture growing to impossible proportions. The toy cabinet that had been at eye level now towered above her like a great glass monument. Or maybe she was shrinking. Yes, definitely shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller until the Persian carpet beneath her felt like a vast landscape of woven mountains and valleys. The Christmas tree transformed into a forest of impossible height, its branches disappearing into darkness far above. Marie tried to scream, but her voice came out as barely a whisper in the enormous space around her. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy and unresponsive, as if she were moving through thick honey instead of air. And then she heard it. A sound that made her blood freeze in her veins, scratching. Faint at first, like fingernails against wood, but growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from beneath the floorboards, from inside the walls, from the very foundations of the house itself. The Persian carpet began to bulge and ripple as if something massive were moving beneath it. Cracks appeared in the wooden floor, hairline fractures that spread and widened with audible groans of protest from the stressed timbers. And through those cracks they came. The mice poured out like a grey flood of fur and gleaming teeth. But these weren't the small, timid creatures that occasionally invaded pantries in search of crumbs. These were monsters, each one as large as a house cat, with eyes that burned like red coals and teeth like curved daggers. They swarmed across the floor in a writhing mass of tails and whiskers, their collective squeaking rising to a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very walls. Marie stumbled backward, fell against the base of the toy cabinet, trapped between the glass and the advancing horde. The smell hit her then, a musty, rotten odour of dark places and things that should have stayed hidden. The mice surrounded her, cutting off any hope of escape, their red eyes fixed on her with unmistakable hunger and malice. And then, rising from the largest crack in the centre of the floor, came their king. The Mouse King rose from the splintered floorboards like something from humanity's oldest nightmares. Even the other mice fell back to give him room, their red eyes reflecting a mixture of reverence and terror that told Marie everything she needed to know about what she was facing. He was enormous, easily as tall as Marie in her shrunken state, his body covered in sleek grey fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A cloak of what might have been velvet draped his shoulders, trimmed with what looked suspiciously like human hair. But these details, disturbing as they were, paled in comparison to the true horror of his appearance. 7 heads. 7 distinct mouse heads sprouting from a single thick neck, each one wearing a tiny golden crown that glittered in the dim light filtering through the parlour windows. 14 eyes all fixed on Marie with predatory intelligence. 7 mouths filled with needle-sharp teeth, all grinning with identical malevolence. When he spoke, all 7 mouths moved in perfect synchronization, creating a sound like a demonic chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Well, well, well," the Mouse King said, his 7-fold voice echoing through the transformed parlour. "What have we here? A little girl all alone at midnight in a place where little girls shouldn't be." Marie pressed herself harder against the toy cabinet, her small hands scrabbling for purchase on the smooth glass. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chittering of the assembled mice. "Please don't hurt me." The 7 heads threw back in laughter, a horrible squeaking sound that made Marie's skin crawl. "Hurt you? Oh, little girl, I'm not here for you, though you've certainly made things more interesting tonight." One clawed finger pointed directly at the toy cabinet behind her, at the bottom shelf where her Nutcracker sat, with his ribbon bandage and patient-painted eyes. "I'm here for him." As if responding to some unheard signal, the cabinet doors swung open with a soft click. But it wasn't Marie's hand that opened them. The doors moved of their own accord, pushed from within by forces she couldn't see or understand. And then the impossible happened. The toys came to life. Fritz's tin soldiers stepped down from their shelves, their painted faces suddenly animate with purposey and determination. Muskets that had been mere decorations now gleamed with deadly intent. They formed ranks on the cabinet floor, a disciplined army no more than 6 inches tall, but radiating the unmistakable aura of seasoned warriors. Marie's dolls cowered in the corners of their shelf, too frightened to move, their porcelain faces frozen in expressions of elegant terror. The mechanical castle's tiny figures had abandoned their endless dance, and now huddled together like refugees fleeing some unseen catastrophe. But the Nutcracker. The Nutcracker was transforming. He rose to his feet with fluid grace, the ribbon bandage falling away from his jaw to reveal that the damage Fritz had inflicted was somehow healed. His wooden features seemed to soften and become more lifelike with each passing second, though he remained unmistakably the same figure Marie had fallen in love with at first sight. From his belt he drew a sword that Marie was certain hadn't been there before. The blade gleamed silver in the moonlight, streaming through the parlour windows, looking far too real and far too sharp to be part of any toy. "Soldiers of Stahlbaum," the Nutcracker commanded, and his voice carried the authority of someone born to lead. "Form defensive positions! The enemy is upon us!" The tin soldiers responded instantly, their tiny boots clicking against the wooden shelves as they arranged themselves into battle formation. Their muskets raised in perfect unison, every painted eye focused on the seething mass of mice below. 200 years, the Mouse King hissed, all 7 heads swaying like serpents preparing to strike. 200 years I've waited for this moment, Nutcracker. 200 years since you murdered my mother and stole what belonged to my family. The Nutcracker leapt down from the cabinet to the floor, landing in a perfect crouch with his sword held ready. Even at his diminished size, he moved like a trained warrior, every gesture speaking of years of combat experience. Dame Mouserinks chose her fate when she cursed an innocent child, he replied, circling slowly to keep all 7 heads in his line of sight. I ended her reign of terror. I'd do it again without hesitation. And now you'll pay the price for your arrogance. The battle erupted without further warning. The mice charged forward in a grey wave of fury and hunger, their collective squeaking rising to a sound like metal scraping against stone. The toy soldiers opened fire, their tiny muskets producing very real smoke and flame and very real bullets that found their marks with deadly precision. Mice fell, but more kept coming. For every one that dropped, 3 more seemed to pour from the cracks in the floor. The toy soldiers fought with desperate courage, but they were vastly outnumbered and slowly being pushed back toward the cabinet. The Nutcracker waded into the thick of battle, his sword flashing left and right as he carved through the enemy ranks. "For honour!" he shouted over the chaos. "For justice! For Marie!" Hearing her name spoken with such fierce devotion sent a shock of emotion through Marie's chest. Pride, terror, and something deeper that she was too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel. This wooden figure, this broken toy she'd bandaged with her own ribbon, was fighting for her, had called her name like it was something sacred. But the odds were overwhelming. The mice pressed forward relentlessly, climbing over their own dead to reach the defenders. The toy soldiers' ammunition was running low. Their formation was beginning to crumble under the sheer weight of numbers pressing against them. And through it all, the Mouse King hadn't even entered the battle yet. He watched from his position near the largest crack in the floor, all 14 eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he observed the gradual destruction of his enemies. Finally, when the last of the toy soldiers had fallen and the Nutcracker stood alone against the horde, the Mouse King stepped forward with leisurely confidence. "And now," he said, his 7 voices speaking in perfect harmony, "we finish what my mother began so long ago." They met in the centre of the parlour floor, the Mouse King with his superior size and supernatural strength, the Nutcracker with his skill and desperate courage. The clash of sword against claw rang out like a bell, echoing off the walls of the transformed room. The Nutcracker was everything Marie had believed him to be. Brave, skilled, noble in every movement and gesture. But the Mouse King had 7 heads, 7 angles of attack, 7 sets of teeth and claws to coordinate in perfect, malevolent harmony. Slowly, inevitably, the Nutcracker was driven back. His swordwork remained flawless, but he couldn't defend against attacks from 7 different directions simultaneously. Cuts appeared on his uniform. Paint chipped from his face. His movements became more laboured as exhaustion began to take its toll. One of the Mouse King's heads darted forward while the Nutcracker was parrying an attack from another. Teeth sank into his sword arm, and he cried out in pain that sounded all too human. The sword clattered to the floor, spinning away across the wooden planks. The other head struck in quick succession. Claws raked across the Nutcracker's chest, tearing through the painted fabric of his uniform. More teeth found their mark, and I staggered backward, crimson stains spreading across the bright colours of his coat. Marie watched in horror as her champion fell to his knees. overwhelmed by the seven-headed monster that loomed over him with triumphant malice. "And now," the Mouse King said, raising one clawed hand for the killing blow, "you die as my mother died. Slowly, painfully, while your little girl watches and learns what happens to those who dare oppose the kingdom of mice." The claws descended toward the Nutcracker's throat. Marie didn't think, couldn't think. She acted on pure instinct, pure love, pure desperate need to save the one being in the world who had fought for her, who had called her name like a prayer. She tore off her left slipper, the one with the little silver buckle that she'd always thought was so pretty, and hurled it with all the strength her small body could manage. The slipper struck the Mouse King's centre head with a solid thud that echoed through the parlour. All seven heads reeled backwards, squeaking in surprise and pain. The killing blow went wide, claws scratching harmlessly at the air. Every mouse in the room turned toward Marie, hundreds of red eyes fixed on her with sudden, focused malevolence. She had revealed herself, made herself a target, chosen sides in a war she barely understood. The Mouse King recovered quickly, shaking his seven heads to clear them. When he looked at Marie, his expression had changed from casual threat to personal hatred. "You," he hissed, all seven voices dripping with venom. "You dare strike the Mouse King. You dare interfere in matters that are none of your concern." He abandoned the fallen Nutcracker and began stalking toward Marie, his claws clicking against the wooden floor with each deliberate step. Behind him, the army of mice began to close in, cutting off any hope of escape. Marie tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The toy cabinet was at her back. The mice everywhere else. She was trapped, a 7-year-old girl facing an ancient evil that had waited centuries for its revenge. The Mouse King reached for her with claws that gleamed like polished knives. Marie stumbled backward in terror, lost her balance, and fell against the glass doors of the toy cabinet. The impact was harder than she'd intended, harder than her small body could absorb. The glass shattered with a sound like thunder, sharp fragments raining down around her. Pain exploded along her left arm as the broken glass sliced deep. From elbow to wrist, the cuts opened like crimson flowers blooming across her pale skin. Real blood, bright and warm, began to flow freely, staining her white nightgown and pooling on the cabinet floor. Marie screamed. Not the theatrical cry of a child seeking attention, but the raw animal sound of genuine agony that no 7-year-old should ever have to make. The scream seemed to shatter more than just glass. The parlour began to spin around her, the mice and the Mouse King and even her beloved Nutcracker whirling together into a blur of colour and shadow. The pain in her arm pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. She was falling, not just to the floor, but through the floor, through layers of reality that peeled away like the pages of a book caught in a whirlwind. The last thing she saw before consciousness left her was the Mouse King's 7 heads, all watching her descent with expressions that might have been satisfaction or disappointment or something else entirely. Then everything went black, and Marie fell into a darkness deeper than sleep, deeper than dreams, deeper than the space between one heartbeat and the next. When light returned, it came slowly, gently, like sunrise filtering through familiar curtains. Marie opened her eyes to find herself in her own bed, in her own room with her own mother sitting beside her, wearing an expression of relief mixed with exhaustion. "Marie," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh, thank God, we thought we'd lost you." Marie tried to sit up and gasped as pain lanced through her left arm. Looking down, she saw white linen bandages wrapped from elbow to wrist, spotted with rust-coloured stains where blood had seeped through the cloth. "What happened to me?" she asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she was beginning to remember. The mice, the battle, the 7-headed king, the shattering glass. "You had a terrible accident," her mother said, smoothing Marie's hair with trembling fingers. "We found you in the parlour this morning, unconscious on the floor beside the broken toy cabinet. You'd cut yourself badly on the glass. The doctor says you lost a dangerous amount of blood." Marie's heart began to pound. "The Nutcracker, is he safe? Did he survive the battle?" Her mother's face grew very still, very careful. "Marie, there was no battle. You had a nightmare, a very vivid nightmare brought on by fever from blood loss. The mind can play terrible tricks when the body is injured. But it was real, Marie insisted, struggling to sit up despite the pain. The Mouse King had 7 heads. The Nutcracker fought him. I threw my slipper and broke the glass when I fell. Her parents exchanged a look over her head. The same look adults give each other when a child says something that worries them deeply. Something that suggests problems they don't know how to solve. "Rest now, darling," her mother said firmly. "The doctor says you need sleep to recover. We'll talk more when you're feeling stronger." But Marie could see the truth in their eyes, in the way they wouldn't quite meet her gaze. They didn't believe her. They thought she was confused, perhaps even disturbed. The battle that had seemed so real, so vital, so world-changing, was being dismissed as the fevered imagination of an injured child. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice began to whisper a question that would haunt her for days to come. What if they were right? Marie wasn't allowed out of bed for 3 weeks. The doctor visited daily, a stern man with wire-rimmed spectacles who asked strange questions that seemed designed to test her grip on reality rather than her physical recovery. Did she know what year it was? Could she tell the difference between dreams and waking life? Did she understand that toys weren't actually alive? Marie answered correctly every time. Yes, she knew it was 1816. Yes, she understood she was in her bedroom in her family's house. Yes, she could distinguish between sleeping and waking. But when they asked about the night of the accident, when they pressed her to admit that the battle had been nothing more than a fever dream, she told the truth. The Mouse King with his 7 crowned heads, the Nutcracker's desperate fight, the army of mice pouring from the cracks in the floor. Every time she spoke of these things, the adults grew more concerned. Their faces took on that careful, controlled expression that meant they were discussing her condition in hushed voices when they thought she couldn't hear. "Persistent delusions," she heard the doctor murmur to her father in the hallway. "The blood loss may have caused more damage than we initially realized. Children's minds are fragile things, particularly when trauma is involved. But she seems perfectly lucid otherwise," her mother protested. "She remembers everything else correctly. She's coherent, articulate, entirely herself except for this one impossible story." "That's often how it begins," the doctor replied grimly. "The mind protects itself by creating elaborate fantasies to explain traumatic events. What concerns me is her absolute conviction that these fantasies are real. She's not simply confused or mistaken. She believes completely and utterly in something that cannot be true." Marie pulled her blanket over her head and pressed her face into her pillow. They were talking about her as if she were already lost to madness, as if the little girl they'd known was gone and someone else entirely had taken her place. Someone unreliable. Someone whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. But she knew what she'd experienced. The memory burned bright and clear in her mind, untouched by their reasonable explanations and medical theories. The Nutcracker had spoken her name, had fought for her, had called her his inspiration in the heat of battle. That kind of devotion, that fierce protection, wasn't something a 7-year-old girl could simply imagine, was it? The doubt crept in slowly, like frost forming on a window pane. During the long, quiet hours of convalescence, Marie found herself examining her memories with the ruthless scrutiny of a jeweller inspecting a stone for flaws. Had the Nutcracker really spoken? Or had she simply wanted so desperately to hear his voice that her mind had provided one? Had the mice truly poured from cracks in the floor? Or had her injured brain transformed ordinary shadows into nightmare creatures? The physical evidence seemed to support the adult's version of events. No mouse droppings were found in the parlour. No scratches marred the wooden floor except where her own thrashing might have caused them. The toy soldiers remained in their precise formations on the cabinet shelves, showing no signs of having marched into battle. Even her slipper, the one she'd thrown at the Mouse King's 7 heads, was found neatly beside her bed, where she'd apparently kicked it off in her sleep. Most damning of all, the Nutcracker himself sat exactly where she'd left him on Christmas Eve, ribbon bandage still in place, painted eyes staring at nothing in particular. If he'd truly come to life and fought a desperate battle for her sake, wouldn't there be some sign? Some small indication that he'd experienced something beyond ordinary wooden existence. But there was nothing. Just a broken toy on the bottom shelf of a glass cabinet, as lifeless as any other carved figure. Marie began to understand why the adults looked at her with such concern. From their perspective, she'd suffered a traumatic injury and her mind had retreated into fantasy rather than face the simple, frightening reality of accident and blood loss. It was kinder, perhaps, to believe in magical battles and noble toy soldiers than to accept that sometimes terrible things happened for no reason at all. The thought terrified her more than any seven-headed monster could. What if she really was losing her grip on reality? What if the vivid, meaningful experience that had felt more real than anything else in her young life was nothing more than the fevered imagining of a damaged mind? She stopped talking about the battle. When the doctor asked his careful questions, she gave the answers he wanted to hear. Yes, she understood that it had been a nightmare. No, she didn't still believe toys could come to life. Yes, she was feeling much better, much more like her normal self. The adults relaxed visibly. Her mother smiled more often. Her father stopped looking at her with that mixture of love and worry that had become so familiar. The doctor pronounced her recovery complete and reduced his visits to once a week, then once a month. Marie learned to perform normalcy with the skill of a trained actress. She played with her dolls in the expected manner, treating them as objects rather than companions. She read her picture books without creating elaborate stories about the characters' hidden lives. She answered questions promptly and sensibly, never straying into the realm of imagination that had once been her natural habitat. But late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, she would slip from her bed and creep down to the parlour. The toy cabinet had been repaired, new glass installed to replace what she'd broken. Through that clear barrier, she could see her Nutcracker exactly as he'd always been. "I know you're real," she would whisper to the glass, pressing her palm against the smooth surface. "I know what happened that night, even if I can't prove it. Even if no one believes me. Even if I'm starting not to believe myself." The Nutcracker never moved, never gave any sign that he heard her desperate whispered confessions. But sometimes, in the uncertain light filtering through the parlour windows, Marie thought she caught a flicker of something in those painted blue eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or sympathy, or simply the reflection of her own desperate need to believe that wonder still existed in a world determined to explain it away. These midnight visits became Marie's secret ritual, her way of maintaining connection to the magical experience that everyone else insisted had never happened. She told the Nutcracker about her days, about the careful performance of sanity she'd learned to maintain, about the growing fear that she really might be losing touch with reality. "They want me to forget you," she whispered one night, her breath fogging the glass. "They think forgetting will make me better, make me normal. But I can't forget, can I? Even if I wanted to, even if it would make everything easier, I can't pretend that what we shared meant nothing." Silence answered her, as it always did. But Marie had learned to find comfort in that silence. It was consistent, at least. Reliable. The Nutcracker's stillness was proof of nothing except that the world operated according to rules she didn't yet understand. Winter deepened around the Stahlbaum house. Snow fell in thick, muffling layers that transformed the familiar neighbourhood into something strange and dreamlike. Marie watched from her bedroom window as children built snowmen and threw snowballs, their laughter ringing clear and sharp in the frigid air. She should have been out there with them. Before the accident, before the questions about her sanity, she would have begged her mother for permission to join the Winter Games. Now the thought of leaving the house, of interacting with other children who might ask uncomfortable questions or notice her strange new reluctance to engage in imaginative play, filled her with anxiety. It was easier to stay inside, safer to maintain the careful facade of recovery in the controlled environment of home, where her parents could monitor her progress and reassure themselves that their daughter was returning to normal. But normal felt like a costume that didn't quite fit. Marie went through the motions of childhood, but the spontaneous joy that had once characterized her every waking moment had been replaced by something more calculated. She thought before she spoke, considered whether her words might be interpreted as signs of lingering delusion. The weight of that constant self-monitoring was exhausting. By evening, Marie often felt as though she'd spent the entire day walking on a tightrope, maintaining perfect balance lest she fall back into the category of children whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. Her relationship with Fritz had changed too. Her brother, never particularly sensitive to emotional nuance, seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in his sister. He no longer teased her about her overactive imagination because there was nothing left to tease. Marie played with toys exactly as toys were meant to be played with. She read stories without adding her own elaborate embellishments. She answered questions with facts rather than flights of fancy. Fritz found this new version of his sister somehow unsettling, though he couldn't articulate why. The dreamy little girl who had once driven him to distraction with her endless questions and impossible theories had been replaced by someone more serious, more careful, more like the adults who surrounded them with their emphasis on reality and practicality. "You're different now," he said one afternoon as they sat in the nursery, he with his toy soldiers and she with a book of mathematical problems their governess had assigned. "Different how?" Marie asked without looking up from her calculations. "I don't know. Quieter, I guess. You don't tell those crazy stories anymore about the people in the wallpaper or the fairies in the dust. You used to make up adventures for everything. Now you just..." He gestured vaguely at her studious posture. "You just do what you're supposed to do." Marie felt a pang of something that might have been loss or might have been relief. "I grew up," she said simply. "That's what happens to children. We stop believing in impossible things." Fritz frowned, clearly not entirely satisfied with this explanation. "But you liked believing in impossible things. It made you happy." Had it made her happy? Marie tried to remember what it had felt like to live in a world where anything might be possible, where magic lurked just beyond the edges of ordinary experience. The memory felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else entirely. "Happiness isn't the most important thing," she said, repeating words she'd heard the adults use. "Understanding what's real is more important. Being reliable, being trustworthy, being someone people can count on to tell the truth." But even as she spoke, Marie wondered whose truth she was telling. The truth the adults wanted to hear? The truth that made everyone comfortable and kept her safe from questions about asylums and treatments for disturbed children? Or some deeper truth that she'd buried so far beneath layers of acceptable behaviour that she was no longer sure she could find it? That night she made her usual pilgrimage to the parlour. But instead of whispering confessions to her Nutcracker, she simply stood before the cabinet in silence, studying his painted face through the glass. He looked smaller than she remembered. Less noble, perhaps. More like what he had always been. A wooden toy with exaggerated features and a broken jaw held together by a child's ribbon. Just another Christmas present. No more magical or meaningful than Fritz's tin soldiers or her own porcelain dolls. The thought should have brought relief. If the Nutcracker was just a toy, then she wasn't losing her mind. The battle had been a fever dream, nothing more. Her parents and the doctor had been right all along, and she could stop this exhausting performance of sanity because she was, in fact, perfectly sane. But instead of relief, Marie felt a crushing sense of loss. If the Nutcracker was just a toy, then the most vivid, meaningful experience of her young life had been nothing more than her brain's attempt to cope with trauma. The courage she'd witnessed, the devotion she'd inspired, the sense of being truly understood and valued, all of it reduced to neurons misfiring in a blood-starved mind. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. "I don't know what's real anymore," she whispered. "I don't know if you're listening or if I'm talking to myself. I don't know if I'm getting better or getting worse or just learning to hide things so well that even I can't find them." When she opened her eyes, the Nutcracker sat exactly as he had before. Wooden. Still. Safely, reassuringly ordinary. Marie turned away from the cabinet and walked back upstairs to her bedroom. She climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally claimed her. For the first time since the accident, she didn't dream of seven-headed monsters or magical kingdoms or brave wooden soldiers fighting impossible battles. She didn't dream at all. In the morning, she would wake feeling strangely hollow, as if something important had been drained away during the night. But she would smile at her parents over breakfast, answer their questions about how she'd slept, and continue the careful work of being exactly the daughter they needed her to be. The performance was becoming easier with practice. Soon, she thought, it might not feel like a performance at all. Like a performance at all. And that might have been the end of Marie's story, a child who briefly touched something extraordinary before learning to live safely within the boundaries of adult expectations. But the real world has a way of intruding on even the most carefully constructed facades, and some truths refuse to stay buried no matter how deeply we try to hide them. It was 3 weeks after Marie had stopped her midnight visits to the parlour that Godfather Drosselmeyer returned. The family hadn't seen him since Christmas Eve, which wasn't entirely unusual. Drosselmeyer kept his own schedule, appeared and disappeared according to rhythms that no one else could predict or understand. But when he knocked on the Stahlbaum door that February evening, he wasn't alone. The young man who accompanied him was perhaps 20 years old, tall and handsome in a way that seemed almost old-fashioned, as if he'd stepped out of a painting from an earlier century. His clothes were well made, but somehow timeless, and his eyes held a depth of experience that seemed incongruous with his youthful appearance. "This is my nephew," Drosselmeyer announced to the assembled family. "He's come to visit from Nuremberg, where he's been studying clockwork and mechanical arts under my guidance." Marie looked up from her needlework, the polite hobby her mother had encouraged to help develop her concentration and feminine accomplishments, and felt her breath catch in her throat. Those eyes. She knew those eyes. The same shade of blue, the same expression of patient kindness mixed with something deeper, something that spoke of battles fought and prices paid. It was impossible, of course. The resemblance was surely coincidental, a trick of candlelight and wishful thinking. But as the nephew approached her chair and bowed with formal courtesy, Marie felt her carefully constructed world of rational explanations begin to tremble at its foundations. "Miss Marie," he said, and his voice carried tones that made her heart skip. "I've heard so much about you from my uncle, about your kindness to broken things, your ability to see beauty where others see only damage." Her parents smiled indulgently at what they took to be polite conversation, but Marie heard something else entirely in his words. Recognition, acknowledgement, a shared understanding of experiences that could never be spoken aloud in present company. "You're very kind," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm afraid there's nothing particularly special about me. I'm quite ordinary, really." The nephew's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, as if he were suppressing a smile. "I think, Miss Marie, that you underestimate yourself considerably. But then, the most extraordinary people often do." Throughout the evening, as the adults made conversation about clockwork and mechanical innovations and the weather and all the safe topics that filled respectable parlours, Marie found herself stealing glances at the mysterious nephew. Everything about him seemed familiar, yet impossible. The way he held his head when listening, the slight favour he showed his left side, as if protecting an old injury. The way his gaze would find hers across the room and hold it just a moment longer than propriety demanded. When the family retired for the evening, Marie lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities she didn't dare examine too closely. It was coincidence, nothing more, a chance resemblance that her imagination had seized upon because she was still, despite all her careful training in rationality, desperately hoping for some sign that her memories of that night were real. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of wooden soldiers and gleaming swords, of battles fought in parlours transformed into vast landscapes of wonder and terror. She woke with tears on her cheeks and her heart pounding with emotions she'd learned to suppress during her waking hours. The nephew stayed for 3 days. On each day, he found opportunities to speak with Marie alone, conversations that seemed innocent enough to any adult who might overhear, but carried deeper currents of meaning that made Marie's pulse race with equal parts hope and fear. On the second day, as they walked in the garden where the late winter sun had begun to melt patches of snow into dark, fertile earth, he asked her about her recovery from the accident. "I understand you suffered quite a serious injury," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "A fall, wasn't it? In the parlour?" "Yes," Marie replied just as carefully. "I was sleepwalking, the doctor believes. I fell against the toy cabinet and cut myself on the broken glass. It was very foolish of me." "Sleepwalking," he repeated thoughtfully. "How strange. And do you remember your dreams from that night? Sometimes the mind holds onto images even when the body is unconscious." Marie stopped walking and turned to face him directly. In the bright sunlight, she could see every detail of his face, and the resemblance to her Nutcracker seemed even more pronounced. But resemblances could be deceiving. The mind was capable of finding patterns where none existed, especially when it desperately wanted to believe in something impossible. "I remember some things," she said slowly. "But the doctor says they weren't real. That blood loss can cause hallucinations, especially in children. He says I shouldn't trust memories from that night because my brain wasn't working properly." The nephew was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks flush. "And do you believe the doctor?" It was a dangerous question, the kind of question that could unravel all the careful work she'd done to convince everyone, including herself, that she was perfectly rational and reliable. "I have to," Marie said finally, "because if I don't believe him, if I insist that impossible things happened that night, then everyone thinks I'm—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Mad," the nephew supplied gently. Marie nodded, not trusting her voice. "But what if," he said very quietly, "what if the impossible things were true? What if your memory is accurate and everyone else is simply unable to see what you saw?" The question hung between them like a bridge across a chasm. Marie could choose to cross it, to step back into the world of wonder and possibility that had nearly cost her everything, or she could stay safely on the side of rational thought and acceptable reality. "That would mean I'm not crazy," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "It would mean you're extraordinary." Before Marie could respond, before she could ask the questions that were burning in her throat, her mother's voice called from the house. Time for afternoon lessons. Time to return to the safe, supervised world of childhood education and proper behaviour. But that evening, as the family gathered in the parlour for after-dinner conversation, something unprecedented happened. Godfather Drosselmeyer rose from his chair and approached the toy cabinet, his glass wig catching the lamplight and throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. "I believe," he said in his strange musical voice, "that it's time for a story." Marie's parents exchanged glances. Stories were risky territory in their household now, especially stories told by eccentric relatives with mysterious occupations and peculiar habits. "Nothing too exciting," her mother said quickly. "Marie has been doing so well lately, and we wouldn't want to overstimulate her imagination." Drosselmeyer's one visible eye glittered with something that might have been amusement or might have been defiance. "Oh, I think this particular story will be quite educational. It's about the true nature of curses and the price of breaking them." He opened the toy cabinet and withdrew Marie's Nutcracker, still wearing his ribbon bandage, still bearing the scars of Fritz's rough treatment. But in Drosselmeyer's hands, the wooden figure seemed to take on weight and significance that transformed it from broken toy to something approaching sacred relic. "Once upon a time," Drosselmeyer began, his voice taking on the cadence of ancient storytellers, "in a kingdom far from here but closer than you might think, there lived a princess whose beauty was matched only by her vanity." Marie felt her breath catch. This wasn't going to be a safe, sanitized fairy tale designed to teach moral lessons to well-behaved children. This was going to be something else entirely. Princess Pirlipat was the pride of her parents' hearts. Drosselmeyer continued, settling into his chair with the Nutcracker cradled carefully in his lap. Golden hair like spun sunlight, eyes like sapphires, skin like fresh cream. She was perfection made manifest, and everyone who saw her agreed that surely no lovelier child had ever drawn breath. The nephew leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on his uncle's words. Marie noticed that he wasn't hearing this story for the first time. This was familiar territory for him, a tale that held personal significance beyond mere entertainment. But beauty, as any wise person knows, is a dangerous gift. It attracts attention, and not all attention is welcome. The queen, who loved her daughter beyond reason, became obsessed with creating the perfect feast to celebrate Pirlipat's christening. She would prepare the most magnificent sausages ever conceived, using secret spices and techniques passed down through generations of royal cooks. Marie's father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sausages seemed an odd foundation for a fairy tale, but Drosselmeyer's voice carried such authority that no one dared interrupt. The queen worked day and night, grinding the finest meats, blending exotic seasonings, creating sausages that would be worthy of her perfect daughter. But she had forgotten something important. She had forgotten about Dame Mouserings. At the mention of that name, Marie felt ice form in her veins. Dame Mouserings? Not a name from any conventional fairy tale, but something that resonated in the deepest chambers of her memory. Dame Mouserings was the queen of the mice, Drosselmeyer explained, his single eye fixed on Marie's face as if he were telling the story specifically for her. Ancient, powerful, and absolutely convinced that mice deserved their share of every feast prepared by human hands. When the smell of the royal sausages reached her domain beneath the castle floors, she led her subjects up from the darkness to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. The parlour seemed to grow quieter as Drosselmeyer spoke. Even the flames in the fireplace burned more steadily, as if the very elements were holding their breath to hear what came next. The queen was horrified to find mice in her pristine kitchen, contaminating her perfect feast. She called for guards, set traps, brought in the court cats. The mice were driven out, but not before Dame Mouserings spoke a curse that would echo through generations. Marie found herself leaning forward, despite every instinct that told her to remain safely distant from stories that might reawaken dangerous questions about reality and fantasy. "You will rue this day," Dame Mouserings declared as she fled back to the darkness. "Your precious daughter's beauty will not save her from my revenge. What you have denied the mice will take from you tenfold." Drosselmeyer paused, allowing the weight of the curse to settle over his listeners like a heavy blanket. In the silence, Marie could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and urgent, as if her body understood something her mind hadn't yet accepted. The queen dismissed the threat as the empty rage of a defeated enemy. What could mice do to a princess guarded by armies and protected by palace walls? But Dame Mouserings was patient, and mice know how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The Nutcracker in Drosselmeyer's lap seemed to be listening to the story with as much attention as any human audience member. His painted eyes reflected the firelight in ways that made Marie think of consciousness, of awareness, of a soul trapped behind a wooden mask. When Princess Pirlipat was still an infant, barely able to lift her perfect golden head, Dame Mouserings crept into the royal nursery. Past sleeping guards and dozing nurses, she made her way to the elaborate cradle where the kingdom's treasure lay, dreaming of nothing more complicated than milk and warmth. Marie's mother made a small sound of distress, perhaps recognizing that this story was heading toward territory she'd hoped to avoid. But Drosselmeyer continued without acknowledging the interruption. Dame Mouserings spoke words of power over the sleeping child, ancient words that twisted beauty into ugliness, perfection into grotesquerie, hope into despair. When the nurses woke the next morning, they found that Princess Pirlipat had been transformed. Transformed how? Fritz asked, drawn into the story, despite his usual impatience with anything that didn't involve soldiers or battles. Drosselmeyer smiled, and the expression was both sad and terrible. Her head had swollen to enormous proportions, completely out of scale with her tiny body. Her eyes, still the same sapphire blue, now bulged grotesquely from their sockets. And her mouth. He paused, looking directly at Marie. Her mouth had stretched into a wide, fixed grin, lined with flat, white teeth that looked more wooden than human. The description hit Marie like a physical blow. She knew that face, had seen it carved in wood, had kissed it goodnight, had defended it against those who called it ugly. She looked, Drosselmeyer said softly, exactly like a nutcracker. The parlour fell into complete silence. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if the flames themselves were listening to the impossible story unfolding in the warm circle of lamplight. The king and queen were devastated, Drosselmeyer continued. They consulted every doctor, every wise woman, every scholar in the kingdom, but nothing could reverse Dame Mouserinks's curse. Their beautiful daughter remained trapped in a body that mocked everything they had hoped she would become. Marie's hands were trembling now. She clasped them together in her lap, hoping no one would notice the visible manifestation of her inner turmoil. This wasn't just a story. It was an explanation, a key to mysteries she'd been forced to abandon. Finally, in desperation, they summoned the court astronomer, a man who had spent his life reading the movements of stars and planets, searching for patterns that might reveal the will of heaven. He studied Princess Pirlipat's condition for weeks, consulting ancient texts and performing calculations that no ordinary mortal could comprehend. The nephew's eyes never left his uncle's face, but Marie sensed that he was intensely aware of her reaction to every word. This story mattered to him personally, deeply, in ways that went beyond mere family history. At last, the astronomer delivered his verdict. The curse could be broken, but only under very specific conditions. First, someone would have to find the Krakatuk, the hardest nut in all the world, a nut so resilient that cannonballs would bounce off its shell, so tough that no ordinary force could crack it. And second, Marie's father asked, despite his obvious discomfort with the increasingly strange narrative. Second, the nut would have to be cracked by the teeth of a young man who had never shaved his face and never worn boots upon his feet. This young man would place the Krakatuk between his teeth, crack it through sheer force of will, and feed the kernel to Princess Pirlipat. Then he would walk backwards 7 steps without stumbling or looking behind him. Drosselmeyer's voice grew softer, more intimate, as if he were sharing secrets meant only for the most trusted confidants. If these conditions were met exactly, the curse would be broken and the princess restored to her original beauty. But if anything went wrong, if even the smallest detail was overlooked, the curse would transfer to the young man instead. He would become what she had been, trapped forever in the form of a living nutcracker. Marie felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she couldn't have explained why. The story was clearly fantasy, the sort of impossible tale that children might enjoy but adults should dismiss as harmless nonsense. Yet every word resonated with the force of absolute truth, as if Drosselmeyer were describing events that had actually occurred rather than spinning entertainment from his imagination. The search for both the nut and the young man took many years, Drosselmeyer said, his gaze now fixed directly on Marie's face. The court astronomer was too old for such a quest, but he had an apprentice, a young clockmaker of extraordinary skill and dedication. This apprentice travelled across continents, through kingdoms and empires, following rumours and legends, always seeking the impossible combination that might save a cursed princess. The glass wig caught the firelight and threw dancing shadows across the wall as Drosselmeyer leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. For 15 years the apprentice searched. He aged during those travels, lost his hair and replaced it with something more durable, lost an eye and covered the emptiness with a patch, lost much of his youth and hope. But he never abandoned his mission. Marie's breath caught as she realised what Drosselmeyer was revealing. The apprentice, the clockmaker, the man who had searched for 15 years to break a curse. Finally, in the city of Nuremberg, he found what he was looking for. The Krakatuk was in his own cousin's house, where it had been kept for generations as a curious family heirloom that no one understood. And his cousin had a son, a young man who had never shaved, whose face remained as smooth as a child's, who wore only soft slippers because his family had never seen the need for boots. The nephew's eyes were bright with unshed tears now, and Marie understood that she was hearing not just a story, but a confession, a revelation of truth so profound that it reframed everything she thought she knew about reality and possibility. The apprentice explained the situation to his nephew. A cursed princess, an impossible nut, the chance to be a hero at the cost of unimaginable risk. And the nephew, kind and brave and completely innocent of the world's capacity for cruelty, agreed without hesitation. Drosselmeyer lifted the Nutcracker from his lap and held it so that its painted face was visible to everyone in the room. In the flickering lamplight, the wooden features seemed almost alive, almost human. They returned to the kingdom, where Princess Pirlipat waited in her grotesque form. The great hall was prepared, the entire court assembled, and the young man placed the cracker tuck between his teeth. With a sound like thunder, the shell cracked. The impossible had been accomplished. Marie found that she was holding her breath, even though she somehow knew how the story would end. The Nutcracker's painted eyes seemed to be looking directly at her, pleading for understanding, for recognition, for something she wasn't sure she was brave enough to give. The nephew fed the kernel to Princess Pirlipat and she began to transform. Her swollen head shrank to normal proportions, her bulging eyes softened into natural beauty. Her wooden grin relaxed into a properly shaped mouth. She was becoming everything she had been born to be, everything the curse had stolen from her. The parlour was so quiet that Marie could hear the wax dripping from the candles, the soft settling of coals in the fireplace, the barely audible sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The nephew began his 7 backward steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One more step and the curse would be broken forever. But Dame Mouserynx, even in death, had one final act of revenge prepared. Drosselmeyer's voice grew heavy with sorrow, with the weight of tragedy that could have been avoided if only the world were a kinder place. As the young man prepared to take his 7th step, Dame Mouserynx threw herself beneath his foot. He stepped on her, killed her, but in doing so he stumbled, lost his balance, failed to complete the ritual properly. Marie felt a sob building in her throat. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the sound, trying to maintain the careful facade of rational disbelief that had become her armour against a world too frightening to face without protection. Princess Pirlipat was restored to her full beauty, more lovely than ever before. But the nephew paid the price for his heroism. The curse that had been lifted from her settled upon him instead. His handsome face swelled and distorted. His proportions became grotesque. His mouth stretched into that terrible wooden grin. Drosselmeyer held up the Nutcracker so that everyone could see its painted features, the oversized head, the wide mouth, the patient expression that seemed to suggest acceptance of an unjust fate. He had become what she had been, a living Nutcracker trapped in wooden form, conscious and suffering but unable to speak his pain or plead for understanding. The story wasn't over, Marie realised. This was only the beginning of a tragedy that had been playing out for decades in parlours and toy shops and the secret chambers of children's hearts. And Princess Pirlipat, seeing her rescuer transformed into the very thing she had been cursed to become, laughed. "Take that hideous creature away from me," she commanded. "I won't have such ugliness in my presence." The cruelty of it took Marie's breath away. To sacrifice everything for someone's salvation, only to be rejected and cast aside the moment that salvation was achieved. It was the deepest betrayal imaginable, and yet it rang true in ways that made her chest ache with recognition. The king, who had begged for his daughter's rescue, banished both the nephew and his uncle from the kingdom. They were no longer needed, no longer welcome. Their service had been rendered, and now they were simply an embarrassing reminder of the price that had been paid. Drosselmeyer's single eye was bright with moisture as he reached the climax of his tale. But Dame Mouserynx, with her dying breath, spoke one final curse. Her son, a 7-headed mouse who had witnessed his mother's death, swore vengeance upon the Nutcracker. He would hunt the transformed prince forever, would never allow him to find peace or love or redemption. The pieces were falling into place in Marie's mind with the inexorable logic of a clockwork mechanism. The Mouse King with his 7 crowned heads, the Nutcracker's desperate battle, the sense that she had witnessed not just a random conflict, but the culmination of a tragedy that had been unfolding for decades. "The curse can only be broken," Drosselmeyer said softly, "when 3 conditions are met. First, the Nutcracker must defeat the 7-headed Mouse King in single combat, must avenge the death that caused his transformation. Second, someone must love him despite his ugliness, must see the prince beneath the wooden shell. And third, that someone must declare their love publicly without shame or reservation before witnesses who can attest to the sincerity of their devotion." Marie felt as though the floor were shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had experienced, everything she had been forced to deny and dismiss and explain away, suddenly made perfect sense. The battle hadn't been a fever dream. It had been the first condition being fulfilled. The Nutcracker's victory over the Mouse King, the beginning of his long journey toward freedom. "But how?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the hushed parlour. "How could such a thing be possible?" Drosselmeyer smiled, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, his expression held genuine warmth, rather than mysterious knowing. "My dear Marie," he said gently, "the question isn't how such things are possible. The question is whether you have the courage to believe in possibilities that others cannot see." The Nutcracker sat in his hands like a sacred relic, its painted eyes reflecting the lamplight in ways that suggested depths of consciousness no wooden toy should possess. And Marie, looking at that familiar face with its patient expression and broken jaw, held together by her own ribbon, felt the last of her carefully constructed rational worldview begin to crumble, because she did remember every detail, every moment, every word spoken in that midnight battle. The Mouse King's 7 heads, each wearing its tiny crown, the toy soldiers marching into formation, the Nutcracker's sword flashing in the candlelight as he fought for her sake, called her name, like a prayer, treated her as something precious worth defending. It had been real, all of it, real. And if it had been real, then everything else might be real too. The kingdom of sweets. The prince trapped in wooden form, the love that could break curses and transform both lover and beloved into something greater than they had been alone. Marie stood up slowly, her legs trembling with the weight of decision. Around her, the adults watched with expressions ranging from concern to curiosity, to something that might have been hope. "I remember," she said clearly, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "I remember the battle. I remember the Mouse King. I remember how brave you were, how you fought for me even when you were outnumbered and outmatched." She stepped toward Drosselmeyer, toward the Nutcracker cradled in his hands, toward the truth she had been running from for weeks. "I love you," she said to the wooden figure, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Not despite what you look like, but because of what you are. Because you're kind and brave and noble, because you protected me when no one else could, because you saw something in me worth fighting for." The parlour held its breath. Even the fire seemed to pause in its dancing, waiting to see what would happen when a child chose wonder over safety, truth over comfort, love over the fear of being thought mad. And Marie, 7 years old and trembling with the magnitude of her declaration, spoke the words that would change everything. "I love you, and I don't care who knows it. I don't care if they think I'm crazy or sick or dangerous. I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I know that some things are true even when they're impossible." The Nutcracker's painted eyes seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. Around the room, the adults watched in stunned silence as their carefully ordered world tilted on its axis. And in that moment of perfect quiet, Marie heard something that made her heart skip a beat. The softest whisper, barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Marie." The voice came from the Nutcracker itself, though its painted mouth never moved. But Marie heard it as clearly as if someone had spoken directly into her ear. A voice she recognised, warm and grateful and infinitely relieved. Her parents gasped. Fritz scrambled backward in his chair. Even the composed nephew looked startled by what they had all witnessed. But Drosselmeyer simply smiled and gently placed the Nutcracker in Marie's outstretched hands. The moment her fingers touched the wooden figure, she felt warmth spread through her palms. Not the ordinary warmth of wood that had been sitting near a fire, but something alive. Something that pulsed with the rhythm of a beating heart. "The second condition has been fulfilled," Drosselmeyer announced to the room. "Someone has loved him despite his appearance, has seen the truth beneath the curse. And the third condition as well, for she has declared that love before witnesses, without shame or reservation." Marie cradled the Nutcracker against her chest, feeling that impossible warmth intensify. Around her, the parlour began to shift and blur, as if reality itself were becoming more fluid, more willing to accommodate miracles. Her mother rose from her chair, face pale with shock and something that might have been fear. "Marie, put that thing down. Immediately. You're having another episode, another hallucination brought on by stress and excitement." But Marie wasn't listening to her mother's desperate attempts to force the world back into acceptable shapes. She was watching the Nutcracker's painted features, watching as they began to soften and change. The wooden texture was becoming more flesh-like with each passing second. The rigid painted smile was relaxing into something more natural, more human. "Marie," her father said sharply, "enough of this nonsense. Give me that toy this instant." Instead, Marie held the Nutcracker closer. She could feel the transformation accelerating, could sense the curse that had trapped a prince for 20 years finally beginning to crack like an eggshell struck by some irresistible force. The room around them was changing too. The familiar parlour walls seemed to be stretching upward, growing higher and more magnificent. The simple furniture was transforming into something grander, more elegant. Crystal chandeliers materialized from nothing, casting rainbow light across surfaces that gleamed like polished marble. "Don't be afraid," Marie whispered to the figure in her arms. "I won't let them take you away. I won't let them make me forget again." The Nutcracker's transformation was accelerating now. Marie could see his painted eyes blink, could watch as colour flowed into cheeks that had been nothing but carved wood moments before. The ribbon bandage she had tied around his broken jaw fell away, no longer needed, as the damage healed itself through some alchemy of love and faith. Fritz pressed himself back against his chair, eyes wide with terror at the impossible scene unfolding before him. "Mother, make it stop. Make her stop doing whatever she's doing." But their mother was backing toward the door, her own face a mask of horror at her daughter's apparent descent into complete madness. "Get the doctor!" she commanded one of the servants hovering in the doorway. "Get Dr. Wendell Stern immediately! Tell him it's an emergency!" Marie felt a stab of sadness at her family's reaction, but she couldn't afford to focus on their fear. The transformation wasn't complete yet, and she sensed that any interruption, any return to the ordinary world of medical explanations and rational thought could shatter the delicate magic taking place in her arms. The nephew stepped forward, his face alight with wonder and recognition. "Uncle," he breathed, "is it really happening? After all these years?" Drosselmeyer nodded, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "The curse is breaking, just as the astronomer foretold. Love freely given, publicly declared without reservation or shame. It was always the most powerful magic of all." The parlour continued its metamorphosis around them. The Christmas tree was growing taller, its branches spreading wider, its ornaments transforming from simple decorations into jewels that caught and scattered light like captured stars. The toy cabinet had become a magnificent armoire of polished wood and gleaming brass, its shelves lined with treasures that seemed to pulse with their own inner radiance. Marie looked down at the figure in her arms and gasped. He was no longer a Nutcracker at all. The wooden features had given way to human flesh, warm and alive and breathing. A young man's face looked up at her, handsome in a way that spoke of nobility and kindness rather than mere physical beauty. His eyes, still the same blue that had gazed at her from painted wood, were now bright with tears of gratitude and something deeper. "Marie," he said, and his voice was exactly as she had remembered it from that night of battle. Strong, warm, filled with affection that made her heart race. "My brave, Faithful Marie, you saved me. You believed when no one else would, loved when love seemed impossible. Around them, the transformation of the parlour reached its crescendo. The walls had become the interior of a magnificent palace, all soaring columns and arched windows that looked out onto landscapes of impossible beauty. Through those windows, Marie could see gardens where flowers made of crystallized sugar bloomed in every colour imaginable, where fountains flowed with streams of liquid gold that caught the light and threw it back in dancing patterns. This was the kingdom of sweets, the realm the Nutcracker prince had described to her during their midnight conversations, the place where magic was not only possible, but inevitable, where love could transform reality itself. The prince rose to his feet, no longer constrained by wooden joints or carved proportions. He was tall, elegant, dressed in a uniform that gleamed with gold thread and precious stones. But his eyes never left Marie's face, and in those eyes she saw a recognition of everything she had sacrificed for his sake. "Will you come with me?" he asked, extending his hand toward her. "Will you leave this world that calls you mad for seeing truth, and enter mine where your vision is treasured above all other gifts?" Marie looked around the transformed parlour at her family. Her parents huddled together near the door, their faces masks of terror and incomprehension. Fritz had hidden behind his chair, too frightened to even look at the miraculous scene taking place before him. They saw only madness where she saw wonder, only delusion where she experienced the most profound truth of her young life. Only Drosselmeyer and his nephew showed any understanding of what was truly happening. The old clockmaker's single eye sparkled with joy at his nephew's transformation, while the nephew himself watched Marie with an expression of hopeful anticipation. "They'll never understand," Marie said softly, though her words carried clearly through the crystalline air of the palace. "They'll call me insane, lock me away, try to force me to deny everything I know to be true." The prince nodded sadly. "The world of adults has no place for those who see beyond its boundaries. But in my kingdom, your sight is the most precious gift imaginable. There you would be honoured not as a mad child, but as a queen who rules through the power of belief." Marie felt the weight of decisions settling around her like a cloak. Behind her lay the familiar world of respectability and reason, where her parents waited with doctors and treatments designed to cure her of wonder. Before her stretched a realm of infinite possibility, where love and faith could reshape reality itself. She was 7 years old, too young to understand the full implications of what she was choosing, perhaps, but old enough to know that some decisions transcend age and wisdom. Some choices are made not with the mind but with the soul, and her soul had been crying out for recognition since the moment she first held a broken nutcracker and saw beauty where others saw only ugliness. "Yes," she whispered, placing her small hand in the prince's larger one. "Yes, I'll come with you. I'll be your queen in the kingdom where impossible things are simply waiting to happen." The moment their fingers touched, the last vestiges of the ordinary world fell away. The style-bound parlour dissolved like mist before the morning sun, taking with it the concerned faces of parents who would never understand what they had witnessed. Marie felt herself lifting, not just physically but spiritually, rising above the constraints of a reality too small to contain the love she had discovered. Below them, growing smaller with each passing second, the house where she had been born became nothing more than a memory of limitations she had chosen to transcend. Her parents would search for her, would call her disappearance a tragedy beyond comprehension. They would never know that she had not been lost but found, not taken but willingly transformed. The prince's hand was warm and strong in hers as they rose together through layers of starlight and crystallized dreams. Around them, the kingdom of sweets spread in all directions, a landscape of wonder that defied every law the rational world held dear. Castles made of spun sugar caught the light and threw it back in rainbow cascades. Rivers of liquid chocolate wound through meadows where gingerbread trees bloomed with frosting flowers. In the distance, mountains of Turkish delight rose towards skies the colour of peppermint candy, their peaks crowned with palaces that seemed to be built from crystallized music itself. "Welcome home, my queen," the prince said as they descended toward the largest of those sugar palaces. Welcome to the kingdom where your love has made all things possible." Marie looked around at the impossible beauty surrounding her and felt her heart expand to contain wonders she had never dared imagine. This was where she belonged, not in the grey world of medical consultations and worried whispers, but here among miracles that bloomed like flowers in the garden of belief. As they landed gently on a balcony overlooking the Candy Kingdom, Marie turned for one last look at the world she was leaving behind. But already it was fading, becoming insubstantial as a half-remembered dream. The only reality that mattered now was the warmth of the prince's hand in hers, and the certainty that love, freely given and fearlessly declared, could indeed transform everything it touched. Behind them, in a parlour that no longer existed except in the worried memories of adults who would never understand what they had witnessed, a broken Nutcracker's ribbon bandage lay forgotten on the carpet. It was the only proof that remained of a miracle that had blossomed in the space between midnight and dawn, between madness and magic, between the world as it was and the world as it could be when seen through eyes clear enough to recognise wonder. And in the kingdom of sweets, where Marie would rule not as a mad child but as a queen who had chosen love over logic, the story that began with broken glass and seven-headed monsters continued to unfold. Not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of imagination, but as a testament to the transformative power of believing in impossible things. The adults would call it tragedy. The children who heard whispered fragments of the tale would call it magic. But Marie, dancing in a palace made of crystallized dreams with a prince who had waited 20 years for someone to see past his wooden shell, knew it for what it truly was. The most beautiful truth she had ever lived. And in that truth she found not madness, but the deepest sanity of all, the wisdom that comes from choosing wonder over safety, love over fear, and the impossible over the merely probable. In the kingdom of sweets, such choices were not just accepted, but celebrated, and Marie would spend eternity learning just how many miracles could bloom when the heart dared to believe in them all. So, there you have it, the real story behind those Sugar Plum Fairy melodies that haunt every December. Not the sanitized ballet version with its pretty pink tutus and happy endings, but Hoffmann's original masterpiece of psychological horror disguised as a children's tale. A story where 7-year-old Marie bleeds real blood defending her wooden prince, where adults threaten institutionalization to silence childhood wonder, where love requires the courage to be called insane by everyone who claims to care about you. The next time you hear those familiar crystalline notes, remember what they're really celebrating. Not Christmas magic, but the triumph of imagination over conformity. Not innocent childhood, but the brutal price of believing in things others can't see. Hoffmann understood something the ballet forgot, that the most dangerous monsters aren't seven-headed mouse kings lurking in the shadows. They're the well-meaning adults who crush wonder beneath the weight of respectability and reason. Marie's choice wasn't between sanity and madness. It was between a world that demanded she deny her own experience and one that honoured her capacity to see truth others missed. Between the kingdom of impossible love and the asylum of acceptable reality. In the end, perhaps that's why they rewrote the story. Because Hoffmann's version asked a question too dangerous for polite society to answer. When the adults around you insist that magic is madness, that wonder is sickness, that believing costs too much, what do you choose? The ballet gives you dancing snowflakes and orchestral swells. Hoffmann gives you a mirror that reflects the cost of keeping your soul intact in a world determined to explain away every miracle it encounters. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most beautiful truth of all. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most beautiful truth of all.